Hello, thanks for tuning in and showing your interest in my presentation. My name is Lukas Arenson, and I'm a geotechnical engineer with VGC Engineering in Vancouver, in Canada. In this presentation, I'd like to introduce a new permafrost distribution model that we recently developed for the South American Andes. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors and partners on this project, Geta Pino, Mark Szymnowski, Pablo Weinstein, and Alejandro Ciccioni from Cernajeomín in Chile. That was fundamental in getting this model work done. Now, the motivation on why are we building this model was to better understand the spatial distribution of permafrost in South America. And this is specifically important when it comes to mountain hydrology and how this may change in the future. There's been a big push in understanding and specifically mapping rock glaciers in the Andes and contributing their ice content and following up that this may be of hydrological significance. However, rock glaciers are not telling the full story when it comes to the periglacial environment and when you look at it from a more holistic view. And that's why it's important to understand how much permafrost is actually available in the Andes. And also, we had some significant experience over the last couple of years to work with big data that allowed us to feel more comfortable and now using those approaches when we developed our model. And why is big data important? That's shown here when I'll discuss the study area that we've used. So first of all, the approach that we were taking was to use rock glaciers as indirect indicators for the lower limit of permafrost, or at least for the presence of permafrost. This is an approach that's been used by others, so that's nothing new. And we know that rock glaciers do indicate where permafrost may be present within a mountainous settings. Now, because we have confidence in dealing with big data, we could reach out to the whole Andes, which is in essence covering from 3 degrees south down to 56 degrees south. That's about 6,000 kilometers, or we looked at a study area of more than 3 million square kilometers. And what's even more impressive, at least to me, that who's not a big data person, is we used the SRTM DEM, and that means that we were dealing with more than 3.5 billion raster points that needed to be calculated during our raster calculations. In South America, we're also lucky that there are rock glacier inventories available in Chile, done by the DGA, as well as in Argentina, completed by Yaniglia. So we have more than 10,000 rock glaciers that could be used as input into developing correlations. And in Argentina, we even have a split between active and inactive rock glacier estimates. So that also allows us to narrow down a little bit where the lower limit of permafrost may be. In addition, we have more than 20 years of experience working in the area, so that allowed us to provide some local calibration of where permafrost may be or may be absent. We used multi-regression analysis. I'm not going to bore you here with equations, but very briefly, we looked at correlations between elevation solar radiation, between elevation and aspect, between elevation slope angle, as well as lat long, so in other words, the location. So this is really also based on a concept introduced by Wilfried Heberle back in the 70s. And we're saying, well, there's no permafrost, or permafrost is possible and permafrost is likely. And then you mix this together and you end up with a permafrost probability value for each raster point. So how do these correlation look like? Here's just an example in a graphical setting for it. So when you look on the left here, you do see aspect. So for example, on north-facing slopes, we do have at a certain elevation, we have no permafrost. Then as you go to higher elevation, we think permafrost is possible. And then at the highest level, permafrost is likely. And obviously, these elevations change when you go to south-facing slope. Please consider that we are in the southern hemisphere. Similar correlations were developed, for example, for slope angle or solar radiation, but here's the slope angle example. Again, we know at steeper slopes, there is a lower probability for permafrost to be still present compared to flatter slope. This is mainly related to the potential presence of ground ice, so the latent heat. Now, all these functions that have been developed are dependent on latitude. So we have a local calibration and a local variations in how these functions look like. As I mentioned, we mix this all together, and then you get a value of 0, 1, or 2. And based on the weighing that was done, as you can see here, you end up with a permafrost probability value between 0 and 2, which we then categorized in these 5 permafrost categories and the 6th category, which is in essence no permafrost. Now, those values that you see here on the right corner are really based on calibration and how we got some local information. So you may argue that these are a little bit arbitrary, and that's probably correct, but we felt by changing these values and validating and calibrating our model against the weighing as well as here the category, we feel quite comfortable in how the model ultimately ends up. But there's definitely room for improvement, and I can see that in the future these values may change. Just to give you briefly an overview of how the results look, here is the model that had been introduced by Stefan Gruber back in 2012, which shows a permafrost zonation index, with green being the fringe of uncertainty. And then we go from yellow to purple, dark blue, where we have higher probabilities. Now, this model is based on 1 kilometer grid, whereas our model, as you can see now, is based on 150 meter grids. So what we've done is, based on the SRTM, which is about a 30 meter grid, we then upscaled it and applied some additional filters and to clean some of the outliers, and that's how we ended up with approximately 150 meter raster resolution. So I'll toggle back here. So again, this would be the global model introduced by Stefan back in 2012. And here is our new model that shows a much higher resolution. But overall, I think it does do a really good job in covering where permafrost may be. So yellow is very low probability and blue is a very high probability. Now, what can you do with all this information as a first step? And in partnership with CERN Geomin, we developed a series of maps that are now in the hands of CERN Geomin to show probabilities of permafrost, mainly for the northern part of Chile, but we also integrated the permafrost distribution map into our internal geohazard management system called Cambio as a tool to allow to see where geohazards may be or may not be. We can also do a couple of geostatistical analysis with it, and here I'm showing you a distribution of permafrost in Chile, And by distribution, what I mean in this case is how much of the total percentage of an area potentially covered by permafrost is spatially distributed from north to south. So when you look at here at around 20 degrees south, we have low areas, but then there is a peak in the areas of around 27, 28 degrees. So this is where we have significant amounts of areas covered by potentially permafrost, which then decreases as we go further south. And then at around 40 degrees south, there's actually hardly any permafrost. That's mainly because of topography, and the mountains are a little bit less high in this area compared to the northern part of Chile. And then as we go further south, that's where the polar aspect comes in. So as you go further south, you're coming into a more polar region, meaning that we have a higher probability of permafrost to be present. Now we can also play a little bit and assume spatial probability. We used an approach similar to what's known for continuous, discontinuous, and isolated sporadic permafrost. So if you group these probabilities from very low and say less than 10% of the area is covered by permafrost to very high, or we say more than 90% of the area is underlain by permafrost, you can develop this min-max area where permafrost may actually be present. And the trend is similar, obviously, than where the area distribution, but we now have actual numbers in terms of square kilometers. And you can translate that into total numbers. So, for example, for the area of Chile, about 17% is underlain by an area where permafrost may be present, so it's one of the permafrost categories. But if you break that down, how much is actual permafrost, you end up with a range 2.7 to 6%, so or 20,000 to 45,000 square kilometers of Chile does have permafrost. And when you compare that to, let's say, the rock glacier area, that's definitely a much larger area. However, when it comes to ground ice, that's still another story that has not yet been written. We can also have a look at how does elevation impact permafrost. And here is a very simple graph with the lowest elevation where permafrost may be found. You can again look at that from north to south. I also have added the average elevation of the permafrost zonation, and that's really driven by the topography. But interesting, we can compare that to some northern plots here, for example, from Harris presented in 1986. And what seems to be the case in South America is that the elevation drops quicker. So in other words, we're getting to permafrost at lower elevations at latitudes where we would in the northern latitude not have permafrost compared to the southern latitude where we may still have permafrost. And the same picture is shown when I compare this to the graph that was presented by Wudong back in 1983, that the plot that was developed back then seems, that was developed for the northern latitude, seems to show that we have permafrost, or there is a probability to encounter permafrost at elevations lower than these general plots that have been presented back in the 80s may indicate. We also did a quick comparison with the work presented by Saito and colleagues back in 2016. So here is a snapshot of their model or of their interpretation of where permafrost may be present, one based on climate conditions. So they looked at current climatic data, that's the dark blue areas, but then they also looked at more environmental condition, which is permafrost not directly derived from current climate data, but interpretation that there is still permafrost available because of historic climatic condition. That's the lighter blue, and then you're getting into seasonal frost or intermittent frost, and no frost down to orange. And if we overlay our model with what Saito has presented, again, we think there's a really good correlation, and the model that is based on rock glaciers and topographic correlations seems to fit quite nicely what others have presented, but we are now capable of using a much higher spatial resolution. So that gets me to the end of my presentation and in the introduction of this model. And we're really excited what actually can be done next. Now, it is the first time that such a high resolution model has been developed for the whole Andes. So 150 meter raster resolution is significant. Now, we understand that you cannot really just go in a single watershed to take this model for granted, but it gives you a really nice regional or continental overview at a scale that hasn't been presented before. We've seen very good correlations with what's out there already. However, we still work with partners to improve the calibration and verification. And once we feel a little bit more comfortable, we're going to make this model available publicly, because I think there are some really interesting opportunities and applications for this model. In particular, there's lots of statistics that can be done with this model. So that's it, and thank you very much for your interest. If you have any further questions, please feel free to send me an email. Thank you very much.